Javier Rupérez was appointed Consul General of Spain in Chicago in July 2007, following 3 years as Executive Director of the Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate at the Assistant Secretary General level at the United Nations. But Rupérez had previously served as ambassador to Spain in Washington from the years 2000 to 2004, during which he made one of his visits, probably both of his visits here to campus, and he held a number of postings in the diplomatic service of his country, including such locations as Addis Ababa, Warsaw, Helsinki, and Madrid. He served as Spanish ambassador to the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, CSCE, which is now known as the OSCE. He served as an ambassador of Spain to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and served as chef de cabinet to the Minister for Foreign Affairs from 1976 to 1977. His parliamentary experience includes having been deputy and senator in the Spanish Parliament during a career of public service that began in 1965. Consul General Rupérez has published a number of articles and books on issues ranging from the freedom of religion and conscience to historical accounts of the work relating to the Helsinki Conference, and he published a memoir of his experience in 1979 as a hostage of the terrorist group ETA. Rupérez received degrees in law and journalism from the University of Madrid. He's also the father of 2 daughters. As I mentioned, we're very honored to have him here on campus. Today, at a special luncheon in his honor, he'll be receiving the David M. Kennedy Center International Outreach Service Award. Please join me this day in welcoming Consul General Javier Rupérez.
Thank you very much, Corey, for your very kind introduction. Thank you very much to John Rosenbeck for inviting me to this university. It's true that this is the 3rd time I've been here, and I hope it's not the last time. And I'm glad to see all friends, Mrs. Rosenbeck as well. And thank you very much for the invocation. I will pray the Holy Spirit to illuminate me in this presentation. I will try and present to you some thoughts about terrorism and counter-terrorism, both from my personal national experience and from my experience as the first executive director for counter-terrorism within the United Nations. And I will try and make a very brief presentation of all those aspects and then listen to you and try and answer your questions. Well, terrorism is very much talked about, but many people at the same time ask themselves, what are we talking about when we talk about terrorism? What terrorism? What is the substance, the essence, or the definition of terrorism? It's true that we do not need to go into very difficult or complicated philosophical questions to find out what we are talking about, because after all, if we try and be precise and get the overall feeling of what terrorism is about, we could say that terrorism is the use of violence by non-state actors to achieve political goals, to achieve political aims. Indeed, if we take that as a proper or a possible definition of terrorism, we could try and qualify one of the elements. We could say that the violence is not any violence, it's the violence which is indiscriminate violence, the violence which is addressed against civilian populations. We could say as well that when we say non-state actors, we make the difference between state actors. We are facing a reality in international law, which is precisely the protagonism played by non-state actors, terrorists. They do not necessarily belong to any particular state. They do not work for any state. We have to bear in mind that terrorism is a criminal activity which is qualified by the political aims, is not any sort of criminality. We have to bear in mind as well that could appear to be very simple to take into consideration, but what the terrorists are trying to do is to terrorize the population in which they live. So those are elements that could be very easily found were we to ask anyone in any part of the world what they understand about terrorism. So whatever the elements or the definition might be, what we could understand very well is what we are talking about when we talk about terrorism. And yet, in spite of that simple approach, which could be understood by anyone, there is no internationally agreed definition of terrorism. And this is one of the problems that when talking in international fora about terrorism, we have to bear in mind. There is not one single internationally agreed definition of terrorism. And the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, why on earth is that possible, that being terrorism so present in our lives, in the lives of so many people around the world, provoking so much suffering and so many problems, the international community has not yet been able to agree on a definition of terrorism? There are a number of explanations, and whether we like them or not, we have to take them into account, because those explanations reflect very clearly which is the international arena right now as far as terrorism is concerned. You know, for instance, that one of the things that is being said mainly by those who do not want to agree on a definition is that, after all, terrorism is rather ambiguous, that people talk about terrorism, but they do not mean exactly the same thing. And they have sort of catchphrase, and, well, your terrorist could be my freedom fighter, indicating that, after all, there could be several approaches to the phenomenon of terrorism and several different and even contradictory judgments on terrorism. I do not share that view, and I will explain why, but certainly this is one of the things we have to bear in mind. There are still societies, communities, countries, governments, which repeat that catchphrase, saying, well, your terrorist is my freedom fighter. Then there are a number of societies, a number of states, a number of communities which do keep some degree of ambiguity concerning the use of violence. Those societies, those countries, those governments think that perhaps violence could be justified in the use against foreign occupation, that could be justified in the fight against colonial powers, that they could be justified simply because of ideologies that pronounce themselves to be in favor of violence. Some other societies, even without ambiguities, but do declare themselves to be able to understand why terrorism or why use violence is there, because violence could be used to right some wrongs, could be used to fight against oppression, be it political or be ethnic or religious or ideological. Could be, they say, useful to fight against the unjust distribution of wealth. Could be at the same time the logical outcome of a number of religious or ideological backgrounds and so on and so forth. So we have to face it. In this world of ours, in spite of our experience concerning terrorism, and there are still societies, there are still countries, there are still governments which either endorse or understand or have ambiguities concerning terrorism. And after all, those countries, societies, governments are represented within the United Nations being the universal international organization, and the United Nations being the result of the will of all the governments that are represented there. They don't give consensus to find that definition of terrorism. And it's true, we have to recognize, and certainly for someone like me working for the United Nations at a given point of time, I have to recognize and to start my work recognizing that I couldn't base myself on something solid, on something stable like a definition, an internationally agreed definition of terrorism. The United Nations, as a matter of fact, is being debated that possibility of finding a definition of terrorism since the 1990s. There is a proposal, a draft treaty, which was originally proposed by India, which, among other things, included a definition of terrorism, which is not very different from the one I told you at the beginning of my words. But again, the United Nations has not been able to reach consensus on that or any other definition. Some of the reasons why they have been unable to find the definition of terrorism has been already mentioned. Some of us could be worth taking into account, for instance, the root causes, which is one of those code words used when talking about terrorism, saying, well, terrorism at the same time is not just the manifestation of the terrorists, the use of violence by the terrorists, is the root causes, the reasons why the terrorists become terrorists, and which eventually might justify the use of violence or the presence of terrorists. But there are some other additional reasons. Those people who have some doubts about terrorism itself or the definition as a consequence of their original doubts say, why are we talking about terrorists, non-state actors, and we are not talking about state terrorism? Why don't we reflect upon those states which could be construed or considered to be terrorists themselves? And now that we are talking about non-state actors and terrorists as a result of those non-state actors, why don't we talk about foreign armies in occupation? Why don't we talk about armies of a given country which in given circumstances could indulge themselves in terrorist acts? And certainly that's been complicated much further up to a point where quite a number of countries have already reached the conclusion that the definition of terrorism is not possible to be found, to be reached, and we better proceed without the definition. And as a matter of fact, this is what the international community has been doing. The fact that the definition of terrorism is not there has not prevented, certainly a number of countries, but even the international community has not prevented the international community to fight against terrorism. So we could imagine that we have a dilemma. How are we going to fight against something that we have been unable to define? And I think the question is, and the answer is very simple, simply because we are not talking about, we are not trying to look or to find that philosophical or even theological discussion of the definition of terrorism, but simply we are going to concentrate on the acts of terrorism, the description, not the definition, the description of what the terrorism is about, the description of what the terrorists do. And certainly in the United Nations in the 1960s, quite a number of international conventions have been describing and condemning the acts of terrorism, up to a point where practically every imaginable act of terrorism has been already described and condemned. If I remember well, there are around 13 international conventions which were approved down from 1960s to 1999, which cover all those acts of terrorism. Why acts of terrorism? Because the international community was very early on in the life of the United Nations confronted with a number of acts of terrorism which were extremely brutal, violent, and bloody. Remember, for instance, the attack against the Israeli athletes in the Olympics in Munich at the end of the 1960s. That provoked a very strong reaction on the part of the international community. And the result was one international convention which was approved by the United Nations by consensus of the General Assembly against the taking of hostages. And some years after the events in Munich, I'm sure you remember that an Italian ship called the Achille Lauro was kidnapped by Palestinian terrorists. And that provoked exactly the same reaction, and that at the same time provoked another international convention which was against terrorism in the high seas. And I'm sure that you remember quite a number of terrorist activities against companies practically all over the world, which led exactly to some sort of reaction. So one by one, all possible acts of terrorism in terms of bombings, in terms of killings, in terms of kidnapping, in terms of taking hostages and so on and so forth, was condemned by the General Assembly of the United Nations. So it's true, we do not have a definition of terrorism, But it would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, for any government to present the case in favor of terrorism on the basis of these 12 international conventions, or 13 international conventions, because practically all the possibilities of acts of terrorism have been already described. Even the possibilities of terrorism using weapons of mass destruction, which was this last convention, international convention, approved by the General Assembly in 1999. So you might say, and recognize as I do, well, it's really a shame that for the reasons I mentioned, quite a number of governments still do not see fit to approve the definition of terrorism, but at the same time, as an official of the United Nations, as a national official, I know very well that I'm moving in very solid ground as far as the fight against terrorism is concerned, because I have the backing of the international community in the fight against acts of terrorism. But even if we go beyond the General Assembly, you know, the General Assembly is there where all the members, there are 192, 93 members of the United Nations get together and pass the resolutions. And we know very well, and certainly for us, people like me who have been working within the United Nations, you know very well the difference people within the United Nations make between the decisions taken by the General Assembly, the decisions taken by the Security Council. And we know very well that those taken by the General Assembly are not, by its own nature, compulsory up to a point in the behavior, in the conduct of the countries. But this is not the case with the Security Council. The Security Council, whenever they take a decision, a resolution, that resolution becomes immediately, automatically compulsory, obligatory for the members to be followed. And the Security Council has been extremely active in that respect as far as terrorism is concerned. We might remember all the resolutions passed in the 1990s against Libya. Libya was a country which was very obviously considered by the international community to be a sponsor of terrorism. In the 1990s, there were a number of resolutions imposing a number of boycotts against Libya. At the same time, reparation for all those victims of those bombings of the two planes, the Lockerbie and the one of the French company UTA, which took place somewhere in Africa. It took some time. It took a number of years. But at the end of the day, Libya had to accept the decision of the Security Council, the authority of the resolutions of the Security Council. They have to pay all the reparations, and they have to accept that, after all, if they wanted to be accepted back into the community of nations, they have to follow those resolutions. So that was the first instance in recent times when the Security Council was extremely active in the fight against terrorism. But then in 1999, immediately after the attacks of Al-Qaeda against the American embassies in Tanzania and in Kenya, the Security Council passed another resolution, which is not perhaps very well known, but it's been extremely active in the fight against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, which is Resolution 1267, imposing a number of sanctions on people related or associated with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And I can tell you, this is, by the way, the only case within the United Nations where there is a list of terrorists, of individuals and organizations. People, by the way, ask quite a number of times, well, where are those lists? Well, the lists, there are two lists. One is the one kept by the State Department here in the United States. The other one is the one kept by the European Union in Brussels. There are no more lists, no more international national lists. But there is one list which is limited to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, which is kept by the United Nations, and that means that all those people and all those organizations, including in those lists, have been extremely limited in their ability to go around the world, to do business, and so on and so forth. So there was already before September 11 an action taken by the Security Council in the case of terrorism. Then certainly September 11 changed very much the perception of the international community concerning terrorism. Those two cases I mentioned, Libya and the Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, were already there, and they were extremely effective, but the scope of the threat and the violence, the brutality of the threat was not completely understood till the Twin Towers in New York and then the Pentagon in Washington were attacked by those planes the terrorists used. And the reaction again of the Security Council was immediate and very forceful. A few days after the attacks, the Security Council approved Resolution 1373, which is, if you want, the cornerstone of the fight of the United Nations against terrorism, and I will refer to it immediately afterwards. And then a number of successive resolutions. You might argue, and I would argue as well, that unfortunately the international community does respond to things that take place. And the international community normally is not able to preempt actions or to imagine what might happen in the future. And if you look at all those resolutions, you would find out that they've been motivated by a concrete action. I mentioned Libya, then I mentioned the attacks against the American embassy and embassies, and then it was the 1373 because of 9/11, and then there is another one which is 1566 of 2004, which was approved by the Council as a consequence of the attacks of the terrorists in the school of Beslan in Russia, in Western Russia. And then there was another one, 1535, which was approved after the attacks in Madrid, in my country. There was another one approved in connection to the attacks in the subway in London, in the mass transit system in London in 2005, and so on and so forth. So that's the way the international community works. Would be very difficult to see those members of the international community, even the United Nations, taking action before things appear, even knowing that the problem is there. But still, even rather belatedly, they take these decisions, and they place on those decisions, those resolutions, the full authority of the Security Council. All those resolutions have been approved under the Chapter 7 of the Charter of the United Nations, which, as you may very well know, imply the eventual use of force, the eventual authorization to use force against those who do not comply with the terms of the resolution. So we have quite a number of legal references, international references, even if we do not have a definition of terrorism. And we have, as I mentioned before, Resolution 1373, which is very much the cornerstone of the international fight against terrorism. That resolution is a rather peculiar member of the family of the Security Council resolutions. The Security Council has been acting on the basis of concrete attacks with names of countries involved or individuals involved. The Security Council does not pass law or international law. That's very much the role of the General Assembly. And after all those international conventions which were approved by the General Assembly I referred to before are international law. While the decisions of the Security Council, which are based on international law, but they imply actions against the violators of concrete aspects of international law. The exception is this Resolution 1373, which is not addressed against anyone in particular. There is no concrete name of any country or any individual mentioned. Is international law. It tries to describe what terrorism is about, and it imposes on all the members of the international community a number of long list of obligations which cover legal cooperation, financial cooperation, cooperation in law and order, cooperation in judicial matters, cooperation in intelligence matters. At the same time, it gives you the number of sanctions which might be eventually used to those who do not respect the terms of the resolution. So it's true we don't have the definition of terrorism. It's true it's rather difficult to reach that definition of terrorism. But it's also true that we have at our disposal a rather solid and robust number of international legal instruments that could qualify for anyone in particular in the international community to justify that fight against terrorism. Another thing is how we judge the performance of all those international instruments and how they've been taken by the international community. I could tell you briefly that Resolution 1267, the one on Al-Qaeda and Taliban, has been extremely effective. I could tell you that 1373, the one in general terms against terrorism, has been rather effective. I can tell you that the 1566 and the 1624, the one relating to the Russians and to the British, have not been that effective. Precisely, the 1566 tried to introduce in the international discussion form the possibility of adopting a definition of terrorism that was not eventually approved. So, what else can we do in the fight against terrorism, knowing the possibilities we have and the difficulties we face? Well, I think that there are a number of things we have to bear in mind. The first thing is that the fight against terrorism should be led in the first place by the nation which is been suffering from terrorism. There is no possible fight against terrorism if the nation involved, if the government involved is not active in that unilateral fight against terrorism. At the same time, we have to bear in mind a number of basic principles. The first one is that there is never justification for acts of terrorism. What about those people with doubts about terrorism? Whatever those people who say that our terrorist is the freedom fighter, whatever the ambiguities or the tolerances, there is no justification whatsoever for the acts of terrorism. And this is not something that I do believe firmly in that thing, but certainly on the basis of the international documents and instruments we have at our disposal, that should be very clearly stated and very clearly respected. There is no justification whatsoever for any act of terrorism. There is no justification whatsoever for the root causes of terrorism to be presented as a possible justification for the acts of terrorism or to legitimize acts of violence. It's true that we do not live in a perfect world. It's true that there are a number of problems that we have to solve. It's true that injustices are committed practically every day around the world. It's also true that by use violence we are not going to solve those problems. And certainly we cannot wait to solve all those problems to start fighting against terrorism. At the same time, those who say that root causes exist, and after all the terrorists are the direct result of those root causes because they would belong or they belong to the downtrodden of the earth. This is not true. Not all the terrorists. As a matter of fact, the majority of the terrorists are not what one would consider to be a part of the suffering humanity of those people who are being treated unequally by history or justice. Yes, the opposite. And among other things, because if the downtrodden of the earth were really going to revolt and use violence, probably we would be facing a number of difficulties we're not facing right now. So what can we do of Bin Laden? Is he a member of a poor family of the Middle East? Certainly he is not. What about the Basques in Spain? Are they poor people who are hungry and do not have anything to do or to eat? Certainly is not true. What about the Red Brigades in Italy? What about the Baader-Meinhof? Were they poor people who had to look for their own subsistence killing people? Certainly they weren't. So this is something we have to bear in mind all the time. There is no justification whatsoever for the use of terrorism. At the same time, we have to be able, and this is something which certainly should be introduced very forcefully within the international community, we should be able to use the same standards of judgment both at home and abroad. Because if we are not able to establish these coherence of standards, it will be rather difficult to develop an international fight against terrorism, because then people will say that terrorism and freedom fighters could be the same and different things at the same time. And certainly we have to try and solve some of the problems that terrorists claim are the justification for their action, because they need to be solved. And I think in particular to the problems in the Middle East, but among other things because whether they produce terrorism or not, they should be solved. The idea that we have to try and solve international problems simply because they produce terrorism would be absolutely wrong, because that would mean that quite a number of problems, serious problems, which exist within the international community wouldn't be solved simply because they don't generate any degree of terrorism. We have to develop that sort of feeling and attitude and approach both bilaterally and multilaterally. And certainly international cooperation is absolutely vital in the fight against terrorism. It would be extremely impossible, if not utterly impossible, to think that the problems of terrorism could be solved only on the basis of national actions. And we have to cooperate with the United Nations as far as it is possible. We have to realize as well what can be done by the international organizations and what cannot be done by international organizations. For instance, one of the things that I felt very strongly when working for the United Nations is that the United Nations cannot cannot predicate a sort of international cooperation in the field of intelligence, because I do not know of any single country around the world who would be able or willing to put its own national intelligence at the service of the United Nations. And let's face it, that's the way the world it is. The United Nations is not the world government, and as a consequence cannot impose on governments and countries some of actions to be followed. But leaving aside the question of intelligence, at the same time leaving aside the question of law enforcement agencies, which are nationally owned, and the United Nations does not have an army, does not have a police. We have to count on the reactions, on the national reactions. But at the same time, we have to be sure that what the United Nations does is to promote and to give international legal backing for the actions against terrorism. And finally, we have to ask ourselves how serious is the threat and how we can respond to it. Well, the threat is serious. We can always argue whether it's as serious as sometimes it appears to be, or is not as serious, whether some governments are trying to use terrorism for their own political gains or not. Those are all valid discussions, but we have to remind ourselves that terrorism is very much there, that if we do not have more terrorist incidents, it's not because of the lack of interest of the terrorists themselves to create or to provoke those interests or those incidents. It's simply because the democratic nations around the world have been able to develop a number of defensive actions against terrorism. So it's very much there. It's insidious. It's not very easy to fight against. We know very well that terrorists are ready and willing to commit suicide for their own reasons. We know very well that they are ready and willing to use any possible weapon, including weapons of mass destruction, for their own causes. We know very well that they have an enormous ability to strike practically anywhere there where they are less expected, and to create at the same time havoc and instability. We have to remember ourselves that terrorism generates terror, that they want to terrorize populations, and we have to bear in mind that terror generates fear, and the worst enemy of democratic societies is precisely fear, because that's the point where the democratic process becomes absolutely impossible to control, and where the movements of the population is absolutely unpredictable. And at the same time, this is where the governments might have the temptation to use ways and means which go beyond the rule of law. And this is one of the things that terrorists are trying to achieve, yes, to destabilize democratic societies, because by doing that they feel themselves justified to attack those societies. So we have to be extremely careful, extremely cautious, and extremely well prepared just to remind ourselves that terrorism is there and trying to provoke as much harm as possible to all of our societies. So at the same time, we have to show a significant degree of international solidarity in the fight against terrorism. When September 11 took place here in the United States, quite a number of people within America started to think that after all there were two kinds of terrorism. One was the Islamic terrorism, which was to be defined as strategic terrorism, and while the other one, the one of a more local nature, being the one we suffer in Spain or the one in the Middle East, was more of a purely tactical nuisance. We do have some experience in that respect. I don't think the Basques are trying to change the face of the world as the Islamic terrorists are trying to do, but certainly they are trying to subvert and to change the normal working of a democratic society. And that could have ripple effects all over the European continent and all over the world. So I think that would be, we would be well advised to not to try and draw any difference between those strategic threats and those tactical nuisances. Some people ask themselves, are we facing the Third World War? I wouldn't go that far. I think it's the system, the notion of war is something different from what the terrorists have in mind. Certainly the classic definition of war is not what we are facing now. But if we let ourselves to be complacent in the fight against terrorism, we might face a situation where the same results could appear. After all, we have to remember that the First World War, the terrible First World War, started by a simple individual act of terrorism, which was the killing of a rather obscure Austrian archduke in the streets of Sarajevo in the month of August of 1914. We have to cope with terrorism within the rule of law. We have to increase the bilateral use of intelligence. We have to improve the response of our police, all the law and order agencies. We have to be extremely careful about what is being the curriculum of some schools in some part of the country, some madrasas, for instance, some Islamic schools, where certainly what is being taught is one of the direct causes for terrorism. We have to increase bilateral and multilateral cooperation. As I said before, we have to increase the cooperation within the United Nations. And the final question is, or would be, do we have any hope that we might eventually see a world without terrorism? Well, it's rather difficult to answer that question. After all, terrorism is a very simple thing to do. You just need a gun or a bomb and go out to the street and kill people who are normally undefended. And at the same time, we have to realize that we cannot have 100% guarantee against terrorism, because 100% against terrorism would be 100% against our system of freedoms. And we have to try and find the balance between the efficient fight against terrorism and the respect for our liberties. And this is something which will be present all the time in all those responsible in the fight against terrorism. But if we are able to remember and to remind ourselves that terrorism does not have any justification, if we learn the lessons of the past and are able to develop properly the work of intelligence and of the law enforcement agencies, if we develop properly the international cooperation, we will be able to fight against terrorism, even if terrorism subsists in one way or another. Because there is one thing that I have very clearly in my mind, and I think that all those responsible for counter-terrorism in the world do have exactly the same conviction, is that at the end of the day, we shall overcome, we shall prevail. Thank you very much for your attention. Well, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. We have a microphone here. If I could ask any of you who'd like to ask questions, please proceed to the microphone. We'd like to ask you to state your name, and if you're a student here, tell us where you're from and what you're studying. We just have a few minutes before we need to move to our next event, but we'd love to hear from your questions in the time that's remaining.
I think it. I know very well that I'm not very orthodox in say what I'm going to say, but I think it's that the European defense should be based on NATO. I think it's all those talks about separated in European defense does not have sense outside NATO. I think that's absolutely wrong. And so I do hope that that idea will become eventually the idea of the Europeans, that they have to work within NATO and with the United States of America. And I think that from the viewpoint of the fight against terrorism, the European Union has been able to develop a number of rather useful instruments because there is, I mean, the degree of integration within the European countries is far bigger, certainly, than within NATO or within the United Nations, and they have developed a number of judicial, legal, law enforcement approaches which have been extremely useful for the purpose of the fight. And the proof is that the Europeans have been able to put together a list of terrorists and terrorist organizations. So, and NATO is doing something. I think NATO is about armed forces, not about police. So the police is more on the side of the European Union. But certainly NATO has been useful in that respect, and what they are doing in Afghanistan, even from the viewpoint of the fight against terrorism, has been extremely useful. So all the Europeans within NATO and all of them fighting together against terrorism, that would be my sort of simple approach.
David Alzinga, I'm a bioinformatics major at BYU. I have a couple questions. You said that if ETA had their way or had their wishes, there would be ripple effects across the world. Could you speculate what kind of ripple effects would those be? And also concerning the UN, it seems like they have armed forces. Are there special forces that they have also that are designed for special cases, terrorist attacks, or do they strictly use armed forces as kind of what we've been seeing with Afghanistan? And one more question, if you have time, what does the UN consider Kurdistan and the people that are Turkey has labeled the Kurdistan, I guess, freedom fighters as terrorists. What is the UN, I guess, thinking? I bet there's no official statement on that, but do you have any comments?
No, Kurdistan does not exist. Kurdistan is part of Iraq, part of Syria, and so that's what the United Nations could say. Certainly, as far as the Kurds are concerned, the Kurdish terrorists are concerned, certainly they are considered to be terrorists, not by the United Nations, which doesn't have the list, but certainly they are considered terrorists by the European Union and by the United States of America. Second point, the United Nations does not have an army or does not have a police. Certainly, what the national armies are trying to do right now is to develop a new approach to counter-terrorism, because you cannot fight terrorism in the old traditional way of the armies attacking who? You don't see the enemy. So it is more up to special forces within the police, within the paramilitary forces, or within the armed forces. But forces especially trained in the fight against terrorism on the basis of intelligence. So that's how it works. And the first question was.
You said that there might be real.
The Basques are claiming, to start with, the Basques are claiming not only a part of Spain. The terrorists in the Basque country are claiming not only part of Spain but part of France as well. Were they to achieve what they want, certainly that would introduce a dramatic change of the political setup in Europe. But at the same time, what the Basque terrorists are saying is not only that they want independence, they want to have a Marxist-Leninist regime in that part of the world. A Marxist-Lenin, I think that's is not a dream; it's a nightmare. But certainly, the notion of Marxist-Leninist regime at this time in history, in the middle of Europe, would have such a catastrophic effect all over Europe that might eventually destabilize Europe itself. So, I'm not trying to introduce a rather mechanical view of the forces of the working of the forces of history, but those things happen. By the way, something similar, though it is not exactly the same, might happen with the independence of Kosovo, which was something really well thought, very badly thought of, and which might have a number of very negative consequences for the stability of Europe. And Kosovo is just 2 million people in the middle of nowhere, lost at the end of the southern part of Serbia. So I think we have to be extremely careful about those things. This is why I feel that certainly the Islamic terrorists are trying to go back to the caliphate, but the Basque terrorists are trying to impose their own will, and with a number of unforeseen consequences. That's about it. Well, thank you very much again. Sorry.